It infuriated the South. And then in 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president.
He was against expanding slavery.
He was.
Right.
And that's when the South decided to secede.
Wow.
They were afraid of what would happen to their way of life. And that's how the Civil War started.
And that was a brutal war.
It was.
Right.
Battles like Gettysburg and Antietam were incredibly bloody.
Yeah.
And they were turning points for the Union. In 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared that enslaved people in Confederate territory were free. And that changed everything.
It did?
It made the war about ending slavery, not just preserving the Union. The Union finally won in 1865. Slavery was abolished, but the South was devastated.
And then they had to figure out how to rebuild.
Exactly. That's Reconstruction.
1865 to 1900, Reconstruction, and the Gilded Age. Okay, so what was Reconstruction supposed to do?
Well, the goal was to rebuild the South after the war.
Yeah.
And to integrate African Americans into society as free citizens.
Right.
To give them the rights they had been denied for so long.
So how'd that go?
Well, there was some progress at first.
Okay.
New state governments were set up. African Americans were able to vote and hold office.
But it didn't last.
No. Racism was still deeply ingrained in American society.
Yeah.
And it did just disappear overnight.
Right.
Southern states passed laws called Jim Crow laws that enforced segregation.
Right.
And there was widespread violence against black people, especially from groups like the Ku Klux Klan. So Reconstruction failed to achieve its goals.
It's a shame.
It is. But at the same time, the country was going through this massive transformation.
The Gilded Age.
Exactly. The late 19th century was a time of rapid industrialization.
Yeah.
You had these huge industrialists like Andrew Carnegie in steel, John D. Rockefeller in oil.
Yeah.
They built giant corporations and amassed enormous wealth.
And they built things like the Transcontinental Railroad.
Right. Finished in 1869, it connected the East and West coasts and really opened up the country.
And this was a time of huge immigration, too.
It was. Millions of people came to the U.S. from Europe.
Yeah.
And many of them came through Ellis Island.
Right, right.
And they provided the labor force for those growing industries.
So a lot of progress, but also a lot of problems.
Right. There was a lot of wealth, inequality, labor unrest, political corruption.
So the gap between the rich and the poor was growing.
It was. And that's a problem that we're still grappling with today.
Okay, so now we're into the 20th century, 1900 to 1918, American imperialism and the Progressive Era. So how does America's role in the world change during this time?
Well, at the turn of the century, the U.S. starts looking beyond its borders.
Okay.
And it gets involved in overseas expansion.
So it's becoming more of a global power.
Exactly. The Spanish-American War in 1898, that's a big turning point. The U.S. acquires Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines.
Yeah.
It's really showing its muscle on the world stage.
Yeah.
And then you have Theodore Roosevelt, who's a very assertive president.
Right.
He believes in American power, and he wants to use it.
So what does he do?
Well, he oversees the building of the Panama Canal, which is finished in 1914.
Right.
And that was a huge engineering feat. It connects the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, makes trade and travel much easier, and really strengthens America's strategic position. But at the same time, back home, there's this growing movement for social and political reform.
A progressive era.
Right. They were trying to address the problems that had come with industrialization,
Okay.
the wealth inequality, the labor exploitation, the political corruption.
So they wanted to make things fairer.
Exactly. They pushed for things like labor rights, consumer safety regulations to protect people from unsafe products, and of course, women's suffrage.
So women fighting for the right to vote.
Yeah. And they finally succeeded in 1920 when the 19th Amendment was ratified.
That was a huge victory.
It was. It was a long, hard fight, but they finally won.
Okay, so now we're into World War I and the Roaring 20s. 1914 to 1929.
Yeah.
So how does the U.S. get involved in World War I?
Well, at first they tried to stay neutral.
Okay.
But a few things happened that pulled them in.
Like what?
Well, Germany was using submarines to attack ships.
Oh, wow.
Including American ships. And then there was the Zimmermann telegram.
Oh, is that?
Germany sent a secret message to Mexico, proposing that they form an alliance against the U.S.
No way.
Yeah, so that pretty much made up America's mind.
Right.
They declared war on Germany in 1917.
And they helped the Allies win.
They did. The war ended in 1918, and then they had the Treaty of Versailles,
right,
which was supposed to prevent future wars.
But the U.S. didn't join the League of Nations.
No, they didn't.
Yeah.
The Senate rejected it.
So they kind of went back to isolationism.
For a while, yeah.
Yeah.
But back home, things were changing rapidly.
Roaring 20s.
Yeah. It was a time of economic prosperity.
Right.
New technologies like the radio and the automobile. New forms of entertainment like jazz music.
Well, it was a time of great change.
It was. But it wasn't all good.
What do you mean?
Well, you had prohibition.
Right.
Which made it illegal to make or sell alcohol.
Yeah.
And that led to the rise of organized crime.
Makes sense. People still wanted to drink.
Exactly. And then, of course, the decade ended with the stock market crash of 1929.
That was the beginning of the Great Depression.
It was.
So from 1929 to 1945, the Great Depression and World War II.
Yeah.
How bad was the Depression in the U.S.?
It was terrible. Millions of people lost their jobs.
Wow.
Businesses failed, banks closed. People were struggling to survive.
That sounds awful.
It was a very dark time.
So what did they do?
Well, Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected president in 1932, and he launched the New Deal.
What was that?
It was a series of programs designed to help people.
Okay.
And to get the economy moving again.
Like what?
Well, things like Social Security, which provides a safety net for older Americans. And public works projects, which created jobs for people who were unemployed.
So the government got more involved in people's lives.
They did. And it was controversial.
Yeah.
But it helped a lot of people.
Right.
And then everything changed again in 1941.
Pearl Harbor.
Right. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
And that brought the U.S. into World War II.
And the U.S. played a major role in that war.
A decisive role. Their industrial capacity was incredible. They produced tanks, planes, ships, weapons.
Yeah.
On a massive scale.
And they were fighting on multiple fronts.
They were in Europe and in the Pacific.
Right.
And they played a key role in the Allied victory.
But the war also ended with a very controversial event.
Yeah, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Right.
A truly horrific event. But it also marked the beginning of the nuclear age.
And the world has never been the same.
No, it hasn't.
So now we're into the Cold War and the Civil Rights Movement, 1945 to the 1970s. So you have these two huge forces shaping America during this time.
Right. On the one hand, you have the Cold War, which is this global standoff between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. They never actually fought a direct war.
Right.
But there was always this threat of nuclear annihilation.
That's scary.
It was a very tense time. And there were proxy wars.
Okay.
Like the Korean War and the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
Where the two superpowers supported different sides.
And then there was the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Right, in 1962. That was as close as we came to nuclear war.
And then at the same time, you have the Civil Rights Movement.
Yeah.
This incredible struggle for equality.
Right. African Americans had been fighting for their rights for centuries.
Yeah.
But the movement really gained momentum after World War II.
And there were so many brave activists.
There were. People like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Malcolm X.
They risked their lives.
We did.
To fight for justice.
They did. And they faced incredible violence and opposition.
Yeah.
But they never gave up. And they achieved some major victories.
Right.
Like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Right.
Which outlawed discrimination and guaranteed the right to vote for African Americans.
But the fight for equality is still going on today.
It is.
Right.
There's still so much work to be done.
Okay, so from the 1950s to the 1980s, a time of huge technological change, the space age, the counterculture movement, and some big shifts in politics.
Yeah, it was a really dynamic period.
So what was the space age all about?
Well, it was basically a competition between the U.S. and the Soviet Union to see who could get to space first.
Right.
And the U.S. achieved a major victory in 1969 when Neil Armstrong walked on the moon.
That was a huge moment.
It was. It captured the imagination of the whole world.
Yeah.
And it showed that America was a technological superpower.
But there was a lot of social upheaval during this time, too.
There was. The 1960s in particular were a time of massive social change. You had the counterculture movement, which rejected traditional values and embraced things like peace, love, and individual expression.
Right.
And you had massive protests against the Vietnam War.
And the feminist movement was gaining momentum, too.
Right. Women were demanding equal rights and challenging traditional gender roles. It was a time of a lot of questioning.
Yeah.
A lot of pushing boundaries.
Right.
And a lot of progress. And then in the 1970s, you had the Watergate scandal.
Right.
Which really shook people's faith in the government.
Yeah.
President Nixon resigned in disgrace.
And then Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980.
Yeah.
And that was a big shift to the right.
It was. Reagan was a very conservative president. He cut taxes, he deregulated industries, and he took a hard line against the Soviet Union.
So the Cold War was still going on.
It was.
But it was coming to an end.
Yeah. The Soviet Union was starting to crumble.
Okay, so now we're into the 1990s and 2000s, the end of the Cold War and the rise of globalization. What were the big changes during this time?
Well, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was huge.
It was.
It was the end of an era. The U.S. was now the only superpower.
Right.
And that led to some new challenges.
Yeah.
Like the Gulf War in 1991. And then, of course, the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001.
That changed everything.
It did. It led to the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Right.
And a whole new focus on national security and counterterrorism.
Right.
And at home, the 1990s were a time of economic growth.
Yeah.
Fueled by the internet and the tech boom.
Right.
But there was also a lot of political division.
Yeah.
And President Clinton was impeached.
But he wasn't removed from office.
No, he wasn't.
Right.
The Senate acquitted him.
Right.
And then the decade ended with the Y2K scare.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
Everyone thought computers were going to crash.
Yeah.
But it turned out to be a non-event.
Thankfully.
Yeah. And then the 2000s were dominated by the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And then the financial crisis of 2008.
It was a rough one.
It was. It caused a global recession.
Yeah.
And it had a long-lasting impact on the U.S. economy.
Okay, so that brings us to the 21st century, the 2010s to the present.
Yeah.
This is the part of the story that's still being written.
It is.
It's hard to have perspective on events that are still happening.
It is. But we can already see some trends that are shaping this era. Technology is advancing faster than ever.
Right.
Social media is changing the way we communicate and interact. The world is becoming more interconnected.
And there are a lot of challenges, too.
Definitely.